Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, why animals live where they do. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Lorraine Doyle and Professor Graham Alexander of Wits University. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Lorraine, take it away.
Thanks very much, Rob, for the opportunity to present today. As you said, I'm joined today by Professor Graham Alexander from Wits. So welcome, Graham.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. So as Rob said, this evening or actually for you guys in the States this afternoon, we're looking at why animals live where they do, and in the context of the discipline of biogeography. So just a little bit of an introduction to Graham. As you can see from these photographs, I think from a very young age, Graham has had an interest particularly in herpetology, and that has been a large focus of his career. So he's been a professor. He's been lecturing at Wits University since 1989. He's supervised at least 50 masters and PhD students and lectured in excess of 15,000 first-year students. So yeah, bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience to the topic this evening. So I think, Graham, to get started, what is biogeography?
Well, hello everyone, and thanks very much, Lorraine, for that introduction. It sounds like I work hard. I'm not sure I do. So this talk is going to be focused a little bit around one of the courses that I've developed at the university where I lecture. It's a course on biogeography, and the presentation is going to be focused largely on Africa, although we will be looking at some other aspects to put Africa in a global context. But really, the starting point is, what is biogeography? Because I know that it takes me a lecture or two to get my students to understand what is the difference between biogeography and ecology. Now, when we go back in the history of biology and we think about people like Darwin and so on, people that we would call naturalists, I would say that that sort of outlook that they had was much closer to biogeography than it was to ecology. So ecology was really born out of biogeography in the 1930s or so, and it was started really by one of the influential people was Elton, and they came across the sort of thinking that ecology was focused on interaction between different organisms. So here we can think about predation or competition or things like that. Before that, these interactions were not really put on the map. Now, when ecology looks at an area and defines areas as biomes, because that's the ecological classification of areas, these definitions are based on interactions that are happening between species in these areas, the structure of the environment, and the function. Whereas biogeography really focuses on the history of areas, and I like to refer to this as the contingency of what's happened in areas to my students. Biogeographers look at the species assemblages in the different areas, in other words, the list of species that occur there, and the evolutionary events that have happened that have resulted in these particular species assemblages occurring in these areas. Okay, so let's just have a couple of examples here so we can get an idea here. So in this picture that you see here, you see a mega herbivore, an elephant. We see fire in the background and we see woody vegetation, and these are all components of what an ecologist would use to define an area as a savanna. Some trees, a grassy layer. This, unfortunately, photo is along a river, so we don't see much of the grass, but look in the background and you can. And the fire is there, burning the grass, changing the structure. So there are these interactions, and these biomes occur only in areas that are seasonal so that the vegetation gets dry enough to burn, and so on. And if we look on a global scale, we see that this sort of biome doesn't just occur in Africa, but it occurs across several continents, as you can see in the yellow area that's designated on this world map. And so if we go, for example, to a savanna in Africa, and we recognize that, we see large trees, a grassy layer, some antelope, which would feed on the grasses and some of the other vegetation. And those are the interactions that are going. And then we flip over to Australia and we see another savanna with large trees, a grassy layer, and herbivores grazing there. But you will have noticed that the species assemblage is different. Okay, so this is the true difference between ecology and biogeography. Biogeography is focusing on what species occur in this area, what is the history and their evolution that allowed them to end up existing in this place. Okay, and so here's another example closer to home. Oh, it's come up as a blank screen, I'm sorry. But what I was going to show you was a photograph of two types of vegetation. One is from California and another is from the extremes of southwest parts of South Africa, that vegetation that we call fynbos. What's the stuff in California called again?
I think it's high chaparral.
It's the chaparral, yes. Yeah. And if you look at photos of these two vegetation types, they look identical. And this is because they have developed under the same conditions with the same interactions and functions of the environment. But if we look at the actual species that make up these vegetation types, they are very distantly related. Okay, so hopefully that just gives us a quick and fairly superficial idea of what the difference is between biogeography and ecology. And so we're now going to delve into the history of the Earth, which is what biogeography is also about. And as I said, we are going to focus on Africa, but we just have to look at another part of the world and go back about 80 million years. And you can see on the screen the breakup of Gondwana, the southern continents, and if you can see my mouse arrow there, I've just got it on India. And 80 million years ago, you see it was right next to Madagascar, over a hotspot. And at this stage, it was about to start moving further north. And we had a big impact 65 million years ago on the Yucatan Peninsula, which caused the mass extinction when we lost most of the dinosaurs. And related to that was huge eruptions on a hotspot where India was at the time. And after that, India started moving north at a rate faster than any other tectonic plate has been recorded moving before. It was moving north at about 15 centimeters a year, and we can see on the diagram on the right that it is now closer to Asia, and it eventually collided with Asia, and we had one section of continental crust subside under the Asian continental crust. And this is the only place on Earth where two sections of continental crust, one has gone under the other one. So normally where this happens, it's the ocean floor that is subducted under the continental crust, and that's mainly basalt and not nearly as thick as continental crust. Well, anyway, this really thick continental crust went under the Asian plate and caused uplift on the Asian plate and the development of the Himalayas. And if we just look at this Google Maps image here, we can see just how large the Himalaya mountains are. And so this happened and started happening between 50 and 40 million years ago, caused this huge uplift, which caused weather changes and the formation of the monsoons, and then incredibly high rates of erosion off the Himalayas. And there were a lot of rock sediments there, like cherts, with lots of calcium in, and these eroded and combined with carbon dioxide that was dissolved into the rainwater and actually caused a negative greenhouse effect on a global scale. And so between 50 and 40 million years ago, the Earth went into an ice age that we're still in now. So let's just quickly define what an ice age is. An ice age is where there is permanent ice on the poles of the Earth. And as you know, we still have permanent ice on the North and South Pole on Earth. So we're in an ice age, but we've been through oscillations in the climate, which has had a big impact on the biogeography of organisms across the planet. But just now, to define this, these oscillations that we are talking about here, we're not going into and out of ice ages. We're in an ice age. We're going through glacial and interglacial periods. Okay, so that just sets the scene for the history of the Earth that has had an impact on the species that occur over most of the planet. So we're going to start zooming into Africa now, just to look at a few examples of really important processes that have happened that has shaped the species richness, the rates of speciation, and where organisms end up occurring in Africa. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to mention here is the African Rift Valley, and just how important this has been for the placement of species in Africa. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see there's a little diagram of what a rift valley is. We form a crack in the continental plate, and then the two sides are moving apart, and associated with that is volcanic activity along the edges. And so we get subsidence in the middle of the valley, but we can get mountain building on the edges. And if you look at the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see right up at the top right-hand corner, the northern parts of Africa, just close to Somalia and the Arabian Plate. We can see just the edge, the southern edge of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and then the red lines show the fault lines that form the Great Rift of Africa. So this process started happening about 25 million years ago, not really very long ago in a geological time scale. And you can also see that around Lake Victoria there, the Rift Valley actually branches into the Western Rift and the Eastern Rift, and then comes around the Tanzanian Craton, which is an ancient piece of continental crust. And then the rift joins in the south, and you can see that there are fault lines that run further south. Now, one of the important things to realize right up here is that the orientation of this rift valley goes right across the equator. Okay, so this next diagram here just shows you where the volcanic activity has been in relation to the Rift Valley, and you'll see along the margins of the Rift Valley, and we have the Ethiopian highlands forming because of this, and this is because of uplift of the edges of the Rift Valley and that volcanic activity. So now, as I said, the alignment across the equator is super important, because there's this biogeographic pattern that we find. And that is, going up a mountain is equivalent to moving away from the equator. When you get high on a mountain, it gets colder, and the habitat types match those habitat types as you move away from the equator. Okay, so what we find here is that when we go down to the southern tip of South Africa and have a look at the species that occur there in the Cape Fynbos, we would have presumed and imagined that these species would have been most closely related to other species of fynbos type of plants that occurred in the other fragments of Gondwana, like in Australia and South America. And although there are a few species that are linked, like the proteas, for example, have got some fairly close cousins in Australia, the majority of species in that fynbos area, and it's one of the richest plant areas in the world, even including tropical forests into that comparison. Most of them, the most common species that are related to it, occur around the Mediterranean. And so during periods where we go into a glacial phase and the conditions become colder, and those cold environments up on those mountain islands, sky islands if we want to call them that, can increase in size and extend down the slopes of the mountain. It is given the potential for plant species to island hop right across the equator down to the Southwest Cape in South Africa. So this can be seen as one of the most important biogeographic corridors in Africa's history over the last 20 million years or so. And it's also caused similar biogeographic patterns with other groups of organisms, for example, the amphibians. Those two arcs of the Rift Valley around Lake Victoria have some of the highest species richness levels in amphibians in Africa, and that's where we're still discovering new species. So this geological formation has had a very important impact on the evolutionary patterns and the history of organisms in Africa. So African Rift Valley, number one. Okay, now you might recognize this. This is a gorilla, and there are actually now two recognized species of gorillas. So this is a Western lowlands gorilla. And if we go to the east, we get the other species. This particular individual would be a mountain gorilla, which is one of the subspecies of the eastern lowland gorillas. And this species occurs in the Virunga Mountains, which also form part of the Rift Valley. So I just want to show you another biogeographic pattern that has been happening in Africa in accordance with these cycles through the glacial and the interglacial periods during this ice age over the last 40 million years or so. Okay, so here is a map of Africa, and you can see the green shows you where we've got rainforests, and I've just got the Dahomey Gap indicating a break in the rainforest for the forests that's in West Africa. Now, during periods where we have some warming, as we're going into a warming phase right now, the pattern that we see, and this is on a global level, we find that the summer rainfall areas, and in this case, it would obviously include the rainforests of Africa, they tend to expand, and the rainfall in these areas during these periods increases. And so when it gets warmer, and if we didn't have human transformation of the habitat, we could imagine that the Dahomey Gap would actually close and allow organisms to extend their range into the rainforests of West Africa or vice versa. But the rainforest in the Congo area, and that also expands, and you can see it's already in this diagram here touching on the western arm of the Rift Valley, of the African Rift Valley. So it extends and it becomes more continuous, and in the past this allowed gorillas to have a more extensive distribution. And then when we went into a cooler phase in a glacial period, the forest shrank, because during the glacial periods, the summer rainfall areas shrink and they get less rain, and this causes fragmentation of the forests, and that's what caused the fragmentation of the gorilla populations and then the divergence in the populations as we've seen. Obviously more complex than I've got time to describe to you here. And this process where you have a widespread or a more extensive distribution shrink and then fragment into these allopatric or disjunct populations, we refer to as vicariance, which is one of the most important biogeographic processes that results in speciation of organisms. Okay, so this is the second process that's been happening in Africa since the onset of the ice ages, was this fluctuation in the forest, and the same thing would apply with the savanna areas. You can see they marked in this diagram here in the orange, and some of the more arid areas. So if we go back to the last glacial period, we see the Sahara Desert in the north there is all desert. Well, just 12,000 years ago, the Sahara was a very different place. And it wasn't a big, extensive desert as it is now. I'm not saying that it was necessarily a savanna, but at least grassland as well. So it just shows you how dramatically Africa's habitats have fluctuated through time. And this is an important thing with regards to speciation events, because if you can fragment populations for long enough without them going extinct, so you don't want the change to be so dramatic that the small isolated populations go extinct, but if they are isolated, the populations can diverge genetically, and this is what promotes speciation. So that would be the second Africa-wide process that has been very important. Okay, and on to the third one. And this third corridor is called the arid corridor. Now, as I mentioned to you just now, when we go through a cooling period and the summer rainfall areas contract and they get less rain, we also have another corridor that forms in the lowlands. So it's aligned also with the African Rift Valley. So in the lowlands between the mountain peaks and so on, we see, and this corridor joins the arid areas of the southwest parts of southern Africa with the arid parts of the northeastern parts of Africa. And there are several species that have actually managed to extend their distribution from one arid area into the next, like oryx, or we call them gemsbok in the southern parts of Africa, and oryx up in the north, and there's some bird species that have done the same as well. So these corridors open and close depending on the oscillation of the glacial and the interglacial periods. And this also causes vicariance when the corridor closes, and the potential for more speciation. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just to have a look at a multivariate analysis that has divided Africa up into subregions. So instead of talking about biomes as we do in ecology, biogeographers define regions around the Earth, and the regions are defined by the species that occur in them, not the processes and interactions as ecologists use. And if we look at the Afrotropical region, which is most of Africa but excluding the Sahara Desert, this analysis here has divided that region into subregions. And if we go down and look in the southern part of southern Africa, we see that there are three different subregions that are defined. And if I can move the mouse arrow down, this brown area here is a temperate habitat type, whereas this brown on the side here is arid, and the blue goes by a few names. We could call it tropical or southeast lowlands group. So now, knowing that that's how those three groups are defined in the southern part of southern Africa, I just want to say from a biogeographic point of view, when the conditions change, if they become more harsh and strained for a particular subregion like this, the distributions of the species will contract. And those most favorable areas where the species can still persist, we say that's the center of the biogeographic area, in this case, a subregion. Okay, so looking at Southern Africa here, I've just shown those same three subgroups, the yellow being the arid western group, the blue being what is currently defined as the temperate area, and you'll notice an isolated population up in the north, which is on the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe, and then the green area, let's call this the tropical subregion of Southern Africa. Now, the center for two of these, the temperate, the blue area, that's the biogeographic center, where the species would contract to, would be in the southwestern Cape. If the land extended further into sea, it would even be further south, but obviously the coastline presents a real barrier. And the arid group has got its center on the west coast, sort of around the Namib Desert. And then the center for the tropical group is north of the map. But we can imagine that when conditions cool and the tropical species contract and move further north, and the temperate area expands, that you are going to get fluctuating distributions of the species that are limited to these biogeographic areas. So just to give you an example, looking just at the temperate areas in Southern Africa, the blue area shown here, this would be what the limits of it would be for many of the species that occur in it during a glacial period. And you can see that if it extends up further north, it means that it connects with the highlands of eastern Zimbabwe, and that's how the species that have got isolated populations there in the first place have got there in history. And now when it gets warmer and it contracts and gets even warmer, the blue area and the species that occur in it contract to this sort of thing, and you can see all the isolated populations along the escarpment of Southern Africa and even up the west coast a little bit. And these isolated populations, so long as they are able to persist, now have the potential to diverge into their own species. So this is how the species are generated in the first place. There are some exceptions and complications to how this happens in biology, especially with plants, because they hybridize and form polyploids very easily. But this is the foundation for how biogeography generates biodiversity on planet Earth. And so just with an understanding about how the temperate area in Southern Africa fluctuates through these climatic oscillations, I'm just going to put up some examples of amphibian distributions. These are just out of a field guide of species that occur in South Africa. And in the top panel, you can see the three maps there. You'll notice all of them occur down to the southwestern Cape. You'll notice that two of the three there have an isolated population on the eastern Zimbabwean highlands, and then fragmentation, depending on the species, along the escarpment. And then on the bottom panel, with the three maps there, we see tropical species extending from the north into Southern Africa. And you'll see in the middle map, the isolated population. So obviously during a previous period when it was warmer, the distribution extended further south, and then it became cooler. It withdrew and left an isolated population there, which now has the potential to speciate from the sister species that it belonged to. So what I've just done with you now is to give you a very brief foundational background on how biogeography explains the patterns of things that we see on the face of this earth. And obviously, there is a lot more detail with the different groups of animals and plants, and there are different modes of speciation, and there are some really interesting exceptions, like what's happened in the Great Lakes of Africa with some of the fish taxa that we get there, and so on. But this just gives the foundation of when you're traveling in Africa on your next NatHab trip, and you moving from the Lowveld in Mpumalanga, and then you go down into the Cape, why you see these dramatic differences in the species assemblages that you see in these areas. Okay, so I've had my say, and I would really like to have some comments from you and some questions, and just to get your views on this. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that, Graham. I think before we hand it back to you, Rob, maybe Graham, just based on the topics that you looked at, like for your master's and your PhD, which were related to certain snake species, how did you, I know that there was a certain transition that happened which was related really to biogeography, in terms of how you perceived the species that you were looking at. Can you maybe just give us a little bit of
Sure. I mean, that's a really interesting question. Thank you. So just to give you some background, in my master's degree done back in the 80s, it was based on biogeography, and I was looking at species distributions and what limited them on a fairly fine scale in those days. And one of the things that struck me is that a lot of the analysis in biogeography was very correlative. So why does the species distribution end here? And we go and correlate it with some weather or climatic condition and say, oh, it must be limited by heat or the water availability or something like that. But we had very little understanding of the mechanistic reasons for why species didn't extend their range further in different places and so on. And I picked up some really interesting trends in my master's where I got these really remarkable records of very unusual species. Suddenly I'm getting multiple records of them from a tiny little patch of habitat in the urban environment where I was working down in Durban on the east coast of South Africa. And so I swung across to really trying to get a better handle on the mechanistic reasons for species limitation. And so I moved across to ecophysiology to try and get a better understanding of how species interface with their environment and what is it about their biology that really limits them to particular areas.
And maybe you can just explain kind of what ecophysiology might be. I think these are terms that are common to you, but I think maybe for people listening are not so obvious.
Okay, well, I mean, as you can hear from the term eco, which means the ecology, or we're talking about the environment, and the physiology, so it's the interface between an organism's physiology and the environment. So for example, and I've worked mainly on reptiles, if an ectothermic animal has to deal with a particular environment, how does its biology and its physiology interface so that it can maintain a body temperature that it performs best at, for example? Because getting knowledge on that gives you an understanding of what might be limiting the species, not just looking at a correlation with the climatic conditions, because that really doesn't give you a causal explanation.
Okay. So I think, thanks very much for that, Graham. I think, Rob, if we can go back to you and we'll open the floor to any questions that listeners might have for Graham.
Great. Thank you, Lorraine. So before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. If you go to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see those 3 lines. They call that the hamburger. Go ahead and click on that hamburger. It'll drop down a menu. Just click on questions and put your question in there. All right, so let's dive into some of these questions. So, could you explain slightly more about how the sediments of the eroding Himalaya and CO2 in the atmosphere kicked off our current ice age? Did the Yucatan meteor augment that weather shift?
Okay, so what happened when the tectonic plate with India on was moving north? Obviously, you must realize that before the continental crust reached Asia, there was a whole lot of ocean floor. And what happens is that when that is subducted underneath the Asian plate, a lot of the sediments on the floor of the ocean get what geologists call accreted on the margin where that subduction is occurring. And if you go and you look at the west coast of South America as well, you find that on the Andes there's lots of marine deposits in that mountain building because of the accretion due to the subduction of the ocean floor. So that happened with the Indian plate moving north and then subducting under the Asian plate. So at the beginning, a whole lot of accretion from the sediments on the ocean floor, and then eventually the continental crust also hit. And then because the continental crust is much thicker than the basalt of the ocean floor, that caused the huge uplift of the Himalayas. I mean, you could take all the other mountains in the rest of the world and kind of add them onto the Himalayas, and you wouldn't notice that much different. They are massive in comparison. So, just to sort of say that this geological event that happened there with the formation of the Himalayas sort of is bigger than really just about anything else that's, happened in that sort of framework with mountain building on Earth in the sort of history that we can measure now.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham. So, does speciation mean that two populations can no longer interbreed successfully, or that they have meaningful genetic differences? And what defines a subspecies?
Okay, so when when I was a postgraduate student, this was a topic of a discussion all the time. But over the last years in biology, I've noticed that um, people are discussing it less now than they used to. So, what we're talking about here are species concepts. So, a species concept is, I mean, the one that a lot of people are probably familiar with is the biological species concept. And here we've got this notion of um, isolated genetic pools with no interbreeding and things like that. But I'm afraid there isn't a single species concept that works for all species on Earth. It's complicated. And what we saw with the development of genetics was that people started defining species according to the genetic divergence of their genes. But in some respects, this is really not as closely related to the biology of those diverging species, if they are different species, than most people think. So, for example, if you are a proponent of the species recognition concept, and just to summarize it very, very simply, the species recognition concept has the notion of, do the individuals of these populations view each other as the same or a different species? Okay, so comparing the biological species concept, lions and tigers can hybridize. So that challenges the biological species concept in that term. Okay, and I mean, some of those examples, I know that the offspring are not fertile and that, but there are cases where hybrids are fertile in some species. But with the recognition species concept, it's really a case of, do the individuals view each other as different or potential mates? And so, for example, if we're using frog species where the males call and the females listening, does she hear that as a call from the same species or another species? And so we could have, if you thinking of species in that term, you could have two populations where there's very little difference in the genetics between them, but the calls have diverged, and so those frogs won't interbreed, but they just haven't had enough years for the genetics to diverge enough for some geneticist to come along and say, oh, look, the genes are so different. Okay, so there are also cases, so you could have species with different species with very little genetic divergence, but you could also have cases where populations have diverged greatly because they've been geographically separated, and so time has just meant that the genetics has drifted apart, but the biology of those individuals there hasn't really diverged, and so they belong to different species now or not? This is a contentious thing and it's not simple. So, I mean, when people go and sort of are pigeonholing things to describe as many species as possible, I always joke with my students and say that's the philately species concept. It's really just stamp collecting. So there is no single answer for this, and I do believe that it's something that biologists should be engaging with much more deeply again, because some of the new species concepts that relate directly to the genetics but with very other little information, there are lots of cases where I think that the answers that they've got are not correct.
Great. Thank you for that thoughtful answer. So, just to clarify, does speciation affect carnivores as well, as such as lions and leopards? Does it affect all animals or just some?
It affects everything. So, I mean, also biologists have tried to engage with the question, is the notion of a species just sort of an artificial construct that humans have made? Because certainly when we go up the sort of taxonomic hierarchy and talking about different genera and families and things like that, those, what you call a single genus or two genera, really that is fairly arbitrary because it's just lumping groups that we think are different species. But in my view, I would say definitely that the concept of species is real, but that doesn't mean that sometimes populations aren't leaking genetics to other populations where they're almost different species, or where they just are making mistakes even. I mean, I've been in a swamp where an African giant bullfrog has tried to mate with my boots, so they do make mistakes.
A fair point. Thank you for that. So, do isolated populations, do they always speciate in new ways, or do they just die out sometimes?
No, they don't always speciate. Sometimes allopatric, those isolated populations can live in isolation for literally millions of years. And I mean, we've got some examples where you get these forest refugia. The east coast of Australia has got some examples, and you have species of skink that only live in the forest patches, and they have been doing that for a very long period of time. And geneticists will come along and sequence the genes and say, oh, they've diverged greatly, and they'll call them cryptic species because the genetics is so different. But we need to get back as biologists to looking at the real biology of those species, and maybe even running experiments of, well, if we put them together, is there any evidence that there's sexual selection, or is they just going to mate randomly within, the two populations and form one population again, or are the hybrid offspring less fit than the ones that are from parents of only one of the populations? I don't see that sort of research happening anymore. And so we need to go back to the conceptual engagement of what is a species. One of the directions that's been going with lately is a lot of biologists are saying using one species concept isn't good enough anymore. And I would agree with that. But the thing is, if you then go and say, based on the genetics, based on the behavior, based on the morphology, based on all these things, they are different species. I mean, I think it does add more robustness to your decision of whether it's a different species or not. But just getting an average like that might not work in every case, but I think it is a step in the right direction. So we are seeing that more and more, that when people are describing new species, that you're not going to base it on one line of evidence anymore. So that is in some respects bringing the biology back into this.
Great, thank you. So, has biogeography ever informed geology with new understandings?
I think absolutely so, because, in the stratigraphy of geology, we often use, when we have a really good background of a well-studied sequence of the fossils in the geology, we can use the fossils to actually date the geology without having to go and use very expensive radioactive dating on the geology and stuff like that. So there is that in that respect. But also, when we look at, for example, the breakup of Gondwana, the fossil history on South America and Africa provided some of the first evidence that the two continents were related. I mean, the geology also matches, but there were mesosaurs and other fossils that occurred on both sides, on both continents, that was very difficult to explain how they had this sort of distribution with the huge ocean between, until we took on the notion of what was originally called continental drift, but now plate tectonics, the movement of the plates. And so, yeah, I think that, the knowledge that we have now of plate tectonics is probably as important as the theory of evolution in getting an understanding of the biology on planet Earth, because those two things integrate so importantly together. And the fact that plate tectonics has been changing the land masses and the water on Earth in this way has also promoted speciation in many, many ways in different places.
Is biogeography being used to predict species migration due to global warming?
So yes, there is a process. So I mean, there's several different ways that a species can respond to climate change. Okay, so for example, they could adapt to the new conditions, or they could go extinct, or maybe they can just survive under the new conditions. But one of the processes that we see very often, and it's starting to be measured in all parts of the world now, is something that we call climate tracking. So what happens here is, when it's getting warmer, we find that species south of the equator will start, their distribution moves further south, and in the northern hemisphere, the distributions move further north. And for example, I think it's in Europe, or maybe in the USA, where some of the distributions of butterfly species have already undergone massive moves in response to climate change. But I mean, I've done work with my students on climate tracking with reptile species in Southern Africa, and it seems to be a very common process. But what I've always got to convince my students is that it's not that individuals of the species that's climate tracking pack their bags and move further away from the equator. What happens is that you get differential survival at the range edges. So where the range edge is getting too warm for the species to exist, there you have higher mortality, and that causes the range edge to move. It's not that necessarily the individuals are packing their bags and moving. And so it's much easier to understand if you have an example of a tree species, because obviously the trees can't get up and move, but they might become not reproductive when the conditions get too hot for them. But on the southern edge, where it was too cold to extend any further north, now that it's getting warmer, they can extend further north. And so differential survival results in the geographic range tracking so that the niche ends up being further away from the equator if it's a warming period, and very similar to what it was when the change started, just further away from the equator.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So, can you provide some predictive ideas on how these bioregions will develop given the coming impacts of climate change, and if the rate of change will cause significant issues for species' ability to evolve quickly enough to adapt?
Yeah, so often you hear read in scientific papers and also in documentaries about one of the problems with the current climate change is that it's happening so quickly that organisms can't adapt fast enough. Well, one of the things is that we've got several examples of an invasive species. For example, the cane toads in Australia are a very good example of how quickly they have evolved in the new environment in which they are. So to think that adaptation can only happen slowly under many circumstances, that might be true, but not under all. Where we're going to have potential problems with warming, if it continues, if we go down to the southwestern Cape in South Africa, for example, where the fynbos is, and we think about the idea of climate tracking there, they can't track very much further south because they'll be in the sea. Now, that southwest part of the Cape there is a winter rainfall area as we see around the Mediterranean. And so if warming changes that into a summer rainfall area, and if there's enough expansion of the summer rainfall area, that's going to happen, then that climate suite is not going to match what those species are adapted to. And so to adapt to a completely different climate pattern is unlikely in the time. And so tracking further south into the sea, we're probably going to see high levels of extinction in areas like that.
Great. Thank you for that. Well, unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you guys for any closing comments you may have for us.
So I think just for me, just to say thanks very much for joining us today, Graham, and for bringing a wealth of expertise and knowledge. I think for me, it always is just so interesting and gives a completely different perspective when you start looking at animals that you're seeing in different parts of whether it's Africa or the globe as a whole. I think it really just makes one think a little more. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome. And I must say that given the short time period that this presentation had to be in, it means that I've had to gloss over a lot of really interesting ideas. So, for example, if you would like me in the future to present something on, for example, how speciation of the African cichlids in the Great Lakes of Africa have speciated. So we start with one species in a lake and we've now got 800 species within that lake. So sort of really more focused biogeographic issues like that. If you'd like me to come back and discuss something like that or talk more about snakes, which are the best animals on earth, I'd be welcome to do it. So
thanks
thank you
very much. Thanks, Rob.
Lorraine, Graham, thank you both so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.